All right, it's live.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to learn about this important and timely topic of police violence and the relationship to state violence, and particularly from an international perspective. My name is Kenny Luisa Ejeda. I am a rank and file member of Portland DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and an organizer for Hands Off Venezuela, based out of Portland. So first off, I wanted to thank you again for your time, and thanks to the time of the panelists for agreeing to be a part of this discussion. This panel is being put on by the Portland chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, but we also want to thank our co-sponsors for the event. So they are the Holy Land Ministry at Spirit of Grace, the Free Democratic Palestine Movement, Bayan, Global Campaign to Return to Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, Portland, and the Northwest Boricua Resistance. Our comrades at Northwest Boricua Resistance are also, they're not going to be able to speak on this panel, but they did want us to share this petition about the police killing of Joel Acevedo. So I believe we will link to that petition in the chat. He is one of a number of Black and brown people who have been killed unarmed as a result of police violence. Very briefly, DSA is the largest socialist organization in the US. Many of our members have been out participating in the uprisings against the US in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. We see the connection between capitalism and imperialism, state violence. We strive to be internationalist organizations, part of the reason why we're doing this panel. And we wanted to take on this issue from a global perspective. As we see the police response to this uprising in the US, the tactics they use and the methods by which they respond have started a conversation about police brutality and their brutal response to protests against their everyday tactics of brutal police, racist policing. Here in Portland, our police are using tactics against us in the streets, such as rubber bullets, which we know were invented by the British to use against the Republican movement in Northern Ireland, foam bullets and tear gas, which we know are munitions and tactics that have been developed and perfected by the Israeli occupying forces. And we know these practices are used all over the world to repress protests and popular movements and are part of exchanges of state violence. So first up, out of respect with everyone's time, we are going to have our first speaker, Parik Chopper Makachir. Sorry, I tried. Was born and raised in Belfast, Ireland. He was in prison for 15 years for his activism. He is now a full-time community and political activist and also involved in the environmental group in the Lenadoon Estate in Belfast. He is also involved in the National Graves Association, who look after the graves of IRA volunteers, and he is a keen member of the Gaelic Athletic Association. Parik is also a trade unionist and member of Lasir Yark. Parik?
Well, I'm a former member of the National Graves Association. I used to be a member of it, where political differences are not there anymore. But you were saying there about the first time that rubber bullets had been used here in the north of Ireland and Belfast. Well, they were invented, well, first used by the Hong Kong police as wooden bullets. And in 1971, just after the introduction of internment, when a lot of hundreds of men were arrested from their homes, badly beaten, it led to a lot of rioting and street disturbances here in the north of Ireland and in Belfast. But the British Army they felt that the wooden bullets themselves were not lethal enough. And these are bullets about 6 inches long. So they were replaced with rubber bullets. And these aren't the rubber bullets that we see being used in your own country. These were rubber bullets that are about 6 inches long, and they were lethal. And a number of people have been killed, young people, And what the British Army would have done regularly was cut off the top of the rubber bullet and replace it with a battery, which was fired from the weapon that they used. And in one case, a young boy, 11, he in the Falls Road, he was killed with it one. But over the years, they then started to use plastic bullets. And these plastic bullets were more lethal. And I myself, when I was 16, I was caught up in a riot in Belfast city centre, which is about 5 miles from where I am now. And I ended up in hospital, being hit in the head with a plastic bullet. Thankfully, I don't think it done me any harm, but it didn't do me as much harm as other people it done to other people. And over the years, there was 17 people were killed with rubber and plastic bullets, and thousands of people were injured. A lot of people lost their sight, but especially if they were supposed to be fired into the ground, and the ricochet, when it hit the ground, it didn't. The impact wasn't as severe as what the plan was. But on numerous occasions, most occasions, they fired them straight at people, whether hitting them in the chest and hitting them in the head. My own cousin, John Downs, was killed with one in Andersonstown in 1984. I was in prison when he was killed. And that led to not only his death, but the death of 16 other people who were killed, mainly young people. John Downs was a young man. He was only 22 when he was shot dead literally feet away when an RUC man, the local police force, which is still using plastic bullets here right up until today in 2020. So that's a brief, very brief history of the use of rubber and plastic bullets here in the north of Ireland.
Okay. Thanks for that, Chopper. Onyesanwu, sorry. Chitoya is an African woman marooned in the US resisting colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. She is an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, as well as the co-editor of hoodcommunist.org.
Thank you. Thanks so much to Portland DSA for convening this extremely important panel. My name is Onyesanwu Chitoye. I am speaking to you from occupied Tiwa territory, also known as Albuquerque, New Mexico, because I'm in the New Mexico chapter of the APRP. But the APRP is a transnational political organization, a Pan-African revolutionary socialist organization that's seeking to liberate people of African descent and also the entire continent of Africa and unify it under a scientific socialist government. But this panel is extremely important because it's extremely important to understand like the model of US policing is not just a domestic problem. The model of US policing is an increasingly international problem, and it has been since the Cold War. I want to talk a little bit about that today because I was a person that was like radicalized initially by the movement for Black Lives 6 years ago. I was recruited out of Black Lives Matter into the APRP. And with that recruitment, I began to develop an understanding of police terrorism and also of the African people's liberation struggle that had like a transnational, like an international basis. And I think it's like extremely key in this particular moment for us to continue to develop like that transnational analysis of police terrorism and of US policing in general. So like in the US left, it's like somewhat commonly understood at this point, especially after like 6 years of Black Lives Matter, the origins of US policing as we know it. Folks tend to understand that they came from slave patrols. Slave patrols were deputized roving bands of Europeans who were empowered by the state and armed to violently bring Africans who had escaped the institution of chattel slavery back into that institution. So like whether you were an African that was like free, like born free, never were a slave, they could like arrest you and bring you back. Or if you were an African who through political organization, escaped chattel slavery, these slave patrols would bring you back. US policing was also born from settler militias. Settler militias were similarly, again, roving bands of European vigilantes that were armed, that were deputized by the settler state to take up the work of indigenous dispossession and genocide. And so we see the origins of US policing correctly as coming from these like twin projects of controlling African people and controlling indigenous people within like the growing early settler state. So that's like a common understanding and that's like correct. But what's less commonly understood is that modern US policing as we know it, like the idea of like militarized policing, the idea of like the so-called warrior cop mentality, was born during the Cold War, was born as a response to anti-colonial and socialist and communist people's movements against US imperialism, against capitalism. It was born as a specific tactic of counterinsurgency to destroy those movements. And it was born with like, so there was like the Black Panther Party in the United States, there was the American Indian movement in the United States, there was the Brown Berets and the Chicano National Liberation Struggle, as well as the Puerto Rican National Liberation Struggle. In the 60s, we saw all of these like domestic colonized populations within the United States raising up national liberation movements, raising up anti-colonial movements that were increasingly beginning to understand ourselves as part of the third world, as part of the global South. And in response, what US police did was develop tactics of counterinsurgency, was develop tactics of surveillance, develop tactics of infiltration in order to like get people embedded in these groups and take them out from the inside. They began to, like when masses of people took to the street in support of these anti-colonial movements, these national liberation movements, they began treating those mass uprisings as like domestic threats, as somehow influenced by outside forces like the USSR. The USSR was like a really common boogeyman, in order to begin to frame just like regular people taking to the street for justice as like domestic terrorism, as like existential threats. And the reason why this happened is tied to like the core reasons for the Cold War, right? Like a lot of times people in the United States are taught that the Cold War was a battle between like so-called good, represented by capitalism in the United States, and so-called evil, represented by Russia and communism. But in reality, the reason why the US took that approach as treating these movements as an existential threat, as treating the rise of socialism as an existential threat, was because because when colonized peoples, racialized peoples, colonized nations began to use the strategies of anti-colonialism, began to use the strategies of socialism and communism to build these movements, it represented a direct threat to the material and political interests of the United States. US capitalism and Western imperialism in general depend on the exploitation of colonized and racialized peoples and nations and lands and resources in order to maintain their power on a global scale. And so when colonized people within and without of the United States began to say we can democratically control our own lives and labor and resources, that was correctly assessed by the United States government as an existential threat to their power. Because without our labor and resources to exploit, the United States would not be a superpower. And so they were correct to say that this is an existential threat. And the way that they dealt with that was to infiltrate and destroy these groups. They did that within the US borders, and then they also began to export those same strategies all over the world, particularly with the end of the Vietnam War, when they were decisively defeated by like a national liberation movement, by a socialist mass anti-colonial movement. The United States was no longer able to like straight up send troops and destroy, these movements abroad. And so what they did instead was they used like this like so-called like soft power of policing, this like soft power of like training, this soft power of like sharing resources and like strategies to export the US model of treating people's uprising as domestic threats, as terrorism all over the global South. They spread it all across the world where neocolonialism and neoliberal governments were in power, and they taught these governments how to do the exact same thing that the US police did to the Black Panthers, the US police did to the American Indian movement, to people's movements in those countries. So like the deadly exchange between the US police and the Israeli police is probably like, people are probably familiar with that, thanks to the work that the Palestinian National Liberation Movement has done, where like, for example, the strategy that the Minneapolis police used to murder George Floyd was actually taught to them by Israeli police and taught to police all over the United States. So folks are familiar with that particular exchange of police strategies, but folks are less familiar with how the US model of policing has been internationalized intentionally as a strategy of counterinsurgency. And it's been spread to Africa, it's been spread to Southeast Asia, it's been spread to Central and South America, it's been spread to the Middle East. These same tactics of surveillance, of interrogation, of infiltration, of counterinsurgency, of using both the judicial system as it's constructed, but also extrajudicial violence to stamp out people's movements. In addition to training the US police forces and US police agencies and US security agencies, and also increasingly private contractors are sending equipment and funding. So they're sending riot gear, they're sending tear gas, they're sending surveillance equipment like drones and more. So they are exporting the distinctly American model of treating like leftist movements, socialist movements, anti-colonial movements as like insurgencies to be repressed all over the world. So that's what I wanted to start with, like how I wanted to open it up and what I'm going to be bringing to the conversation today.
Thanks for that. Next up is Tato Masianguako. She's a researcher based in South Africa at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, and also a member of the Anti-Repression Working Group of the C19 People's Coalition. She holds an MA in politics from the University of Witwatersrand and an MSc in African politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Tato's work at CIRI focuses on the misuse of the criminal justice system, police brutality, and police accountability.
Thank you so much. And thanks again to Portland DSA for hosting this. I echo the previous speakers' sentiments. So police and other forms of state-sanctioned violence against popular movements in South Africa today date back to South Africa's history of apartheid and colonial rule. And since South Africa's shift from apartheid to constitutional democracy, there have been various incidents of police violence that have demonstrated a failure to constrain excessive uses of force by the police and sufficiently rid the police of all the patterns of violence. These incidents have illustrated the extent to which the police in South Africa have failed to transform in nature, and in particular its treatment of poor Black people, and have highlighted the dangerous role that the police have come to play in suppressing popular movements that have been especially critical of the government and have been deemed as a threat to the social, economic, and political status quo in South Africa. And so what has been a routine treatment of poor Black people in South Africa was again put under the spotlight during the COVID-19 nationwide lockdown announced by the president. Even in the very early days of the lockdown, when 3 people were reportedly killed by the security forces, a number that was higher at the time than the deaths by COVID. It is only after the uprising in the US following the death of George Floyd that our president was finally able to say Collins Khosa's name. It was only then that he was finally able to address what was happening locally, and when he finally expressed deep regret, as he put it. Collins Khosa was a man who died from injuries sustained from a brutal assault by members of the South African National Defence Force on the 10th of April in Alexandra Township. And it has therefore come as no surprise that South Africa's response to the pandemic has been described by Georgette Gagnon of the United Nations Human Rights Office as a toxic lockdown culture. Today, at least 12 people have been killed by members of the security forces during the enforcement of this lockdown. But during this lockdown, we've also witnessed state-sanctioned violence in the form of very brutal and unlawful demolitions of people's homes, despite the national moratorium on evictions, which was instituted by the national government. These too are not at all new, but have been put into sharp focus by the lockdown. These evictions have been ordered by local municipalities across the country and carried out and have been carried out by security force actors ranging from local and metropolitan law enforcement, national police, private security forces, and sometimes during the lockdown, we've seen that they've been accompanied by the military. This has happened in South Africa 26 years after the ascent of democracy, and in a context where over 6 million people have had to occupy private and state-owned land to set up their homes in order to move closer to places of economic opportunity and other social amenities. In one of the most recent spates, Metro Police officers ordered by the city of Cape Town hauled a man out of his shack while he was naked in order to tear down his home. Even during a global pandemic, local government in South Africa has insisted on continuing their attack on poor Black communities. And they've continued to claim that they're merely preventing the illegal occupation of land by demolishing unoccupied structures, despite evidence to the contrary in almost all of these cases. This is also in a country that's struggled to effectively carry out land reform. And so the Socio-Economic Rights Institute has had firsthand experiences of incidents like this and has witnessed firsthand the devastating impact that police and state violence has on communities and groups, and particularly the impact that the lack of accountability has had on victims. And so I'll speak, I think, as briefly as possible on two examples, which I think are quite well known, but just as a way of sharing the ways in which police and state violence have manifested themselves in South Africa. SERI works, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute works in three themes, and we are a nonprofit human rights organization that works with social movements, communities, and other groups to challenge inequality by advocating for the realization of socioeconomic rights. And we do this work through litigation, research, and advocacy. And we work in three themes, namely securing a home, making a living, and expanding political space. And it is in the thematic area of expanding political space where we confront the misuse of the criminal justice system used to suppress community-based protests and the misuse of the police in poor and vulnerable communities. And often what we found is that this work has come out of the struggles that communities have waged in order to realize their socioeconomic rights through protest action. And so one well-known example of police violence since 1994 is what has come to be known as the Marikana Massacre. SERI represents the 36 families of the miners who were killed between the 13th and the 16th of August in 2012 during a labor strike in the platinum mining area of Marikana in the Northwest Province. 34 miners were killed by the police on the 16th of August when they used lethal force to end a protracted strike that had started 6 days earlier. The other 2 miners were killed in the days leading up to the 16th of August. And so on the morning of the 16th of August in 2012, the police implemented a tactical plan to end the strike in which the first 70 miners were killed when the police shot into the crowd. And when the miners fled and tried to hide, the police then pursued them and killed the additional 17 miners, pursuing them and finding them hidden, trying to hide from the police. It's important again to remember that this was a labor dispute between a mine and its employees over wages, and that is what the police responded to with lethal force. SERI represented the family throughout the Judicial Commission of Inquiry, which sat for 2 years looking into what had happened. And next month will mark the 8th year since the massacre. The then Minister of Police commissioned a report by an expert panel on public order policing in order to find recommendations in order to address the crisis in policing. And that report was completed in April of 2018, but of course, it's yet to be made public. Another example that you may be well aware of are the student protests, which took off in 2015, and a second wave took off in 2016. SERI represented some of the students and bystanders who got arrested or were injured by the police during the protest. Wits University, my university that I went to, in September of 2016, I believe, like many other universities across the country, invited the police onto their campuses to provide assistance with managing the protests. And the police operated alongside university campus security and private security. And so in a report that we did looking at injuries from the incidents of unjustified and unlawful uses of force, we found that grave injuries, some that Patrick described, grave injuries from the misuse of less lethal weapons included burns to the face, loss of an eye, multiple rubber bullet injuries to individuals. And in one specific example, 3 police officers attacked a student in her campus accommodation room during the night because the university had instituted a curfew, and they came in inquiring about why she was still awake and accusing her of being a part of the protests. 2 of the officers assaulted her while a third shot her at near contact range in her upper thigh, leaving her with an awful wound from a rubber bullet. And the police, of course, are yet to be held accountable for incidents like this. And so that often leaves victims with no option but to seek civil damages because of how dire the situation of accountability in South Africa has been. But these injuries are very similar to those that we've seen reported during this current waves of the Black Lives Matter protests, in which we've seen the police respond extremely violently and in many cases deliberately seen to escalate instead of de-escalate the tensions. And so living in one of the most unequal countries in the world, poor people in South Africa have had to confront poverty, unemployment, and poor service delivery in the face of widespread corruption at various levels of government. And so protests and popular movements amongst communities, workers, and groups have emerged out of a context where they have been systematically sidelined from decision-making processes pertaining to their lives and pushed out of the forums in their own communities. In South Africa, communities and groups have had to turn to protest as a measure of last resort in order to make their grievances known. And in a context of an increasingly unresponsive government and poor basic delivery of services, the police have become the body with which protesting groups are confronted. David Mansley, a policing scholar, has argued along with many others that the toleration of protest is one of the tests of democratic culture, and that hard or paramilitary policing is associated with neoliberalism. Hard policing would be that illustrated in the use of riot gear, containment, surveillance, and the imposition of banning orders and conditions on demonstrations. And in South Africa, we saw this escalate in particular between 2009 and 2011 under the Minister of the then Minister of Police, Natim Tetwa, and the then newly appointed South African Police Commissioner, Bheki Cele, who was well known for his shoot to kill philosophy. Today, Bheki Cele is our Minister of Police, and he's recently denied that there's any issue of police brutality in South Africa. Marikana became a sobering manifestation of policing that displayed elements of militarization in these forms. And so what we've seen in South Africa is that the police have maintained an affinity to violence, particularly in response to protest action. And this has been partly due to police leadership that has often encouraged excessive and often lethal uses of force in the fight against crime. However, the failure to hold the police accountable for their excesses in the management of protests has displayed a lack of political will and indicates a disdain for dissent in South Africa. And so what I'd want to contribute and perhaps highlight, which I think we're all aware of, is that when the police in South Africa resemble what the police look like in India or the police in Kenya or the police in the US for that matter, we can make no mistake about how they define the groups against which they claim to be bringing in line with the law, or the groups for whom they carry out their duties to restore order. We can also make no mistake about the structure in which they operate, a structure that is inherently anti-poor, inherently anti-Black and brown, and a structure whose violence is never fully accounted for precisely because of whom its victims are. Thank you.
Thank you, Tato. Next, we would have had a speaker based out of Gaza. Khadir Eid is an Al-Shabaka Policy Advisor, Associate Professor of Postcolonial and Postmodern Literature at Gaza's Al-Aqsa University in Gaza, Palestine. Khadir is the author of Worlding Postmodernism, Interpretive Possibilities of Critical Theory Encountering the Palestinian Nakba, One State for All. We would have had Khadir, but we have not been able to make contact with him. I know I asked folks on the panel to give a phonetic spelling of their name, that way I could do my best to pronounce it. And I got an automatic response to his email where he states, I'm currently living in Gaza, which has been under a barbaric Israeli siege for more than 12 years. The worst aspect of this hermetic blockade is a constant power outage. Please be understanding if I do not respond immediately. I am doing my best. So anticipating that, we are going to play a video that we pre-recorded specifically to anticipate this.
Hi, let me begin by thanking the organizers of this important webinar. It's a great honor indeed to be sharing a platform with comrades from South Africa, America, and Ireland. And let me start by giving you a bit of some background about life in Palestine in general, and in Gaza in particular, where I am living. Most of you already know this, but in the last 10 years, Israel has launched 3 massive genocidal wars of aggression on the occupied Gaza Strip. Many of our civilians were massacred by Israel's indiscriminate bombing, which was condemned by UN experts and leading human rights organizations as war crimes and possible crimes against humanity. These horrendous assaults left over 3,800 Palestinians dead, predominantly civilians, of whom hundreds were children, and another 15,000 were injured. We, the 2 million Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip, the overwhelming majority of whom are refugees, were violently expelled and dispossessed from our homes by Zionist forces in 1948, were subjected to 3 weeks in 2009, and to 2 weeks in 2012, and 51 days in 2014 of relentless Israeli state terror, whereby Israeli warplanes systematically targeted civilian areas, reduced whole neighborhoods and vital civilian infrastructure to rubble, and destroyed scores of schools. This came after years of an ongoing crippling medieval Israeli siege of Gaza, which is a severe form of collective punishment. So in addition to Israel's daily attacks and airstrikes, Gazans also suffer from the contamination of water, air, and soil, medical conditions due to injuries from internationally prohibited butterfly bullets and other illegal Israeli weapons, as well as from water contamination, cannot be treated because of the siege. In addition to the ban on building materials, Israel also prevents many other necessities from being imported. Add to this the drastic cuts endorsed by the drastic cuts endorsed by the United States of America and by UNRWA, not to mention the constant closure of the Rafah crossing, which is the only exit Gaza has to the external world, all of which leading to one of the highest unemployment rates and poverty on the face of the earth. And now, as most of you already know, Israel has decided to become openly an apartheid state by legalizing racial discrimination. I personally have tried very hard to find out whether there are constitutions or laws in the world similar to Israel's new nation state basic law, which aims to establish legal basis for Jewish supremacy and racism against the indigenous Palestinians, including those living in what has become the largest open air prison on earth, Gaza. I found out that only South Africa under apartheid and America in the eras of slavery and segregation, the Jim Crow laws. Never before has a population been denied the basic requirements for survival as a deliberate policy of colonization, occupation, and apartheid. This is what Israel is doing to us, the people Gaza in particular. Now, since the beginning of the Great March of Return 3 years ago, nearly 350 Palestinians have been killed, including more than 55 children and 6 women. 30,000 civilians have been injured. Most are young people, many of them children. Of those wounded, 3,500 injuries have been with live fire by snipers. We are certain that apartheid Israel is intent, excuse me, apartheid Israel is intent on solving its problem with the surplus population of the native Palestinians of Gaza by simply maiming most of them, considering the fact that the Israeli occupation forces stationed behind the Gaza fence are using fatal bullets that are, according to international laws, prohibited. These bullets have been used against peaceful demonstrators. The excuse? Israel needs one, of course. Well, the excuse is that Palestinians of Gaza are trying to infiltrate the borders. The whole idea of infiltration misrepresents reality. Palestinians in Gaza are not infiltrators. They are people under occupation, and an unprecedented medieval blockade has been imposed on them. Gaza has been turned into what UN Human Rights Chief Zaid Ra'ad Hussein called toxic slum. Now, in order, just for people listening now and watching this, in order to understand the mentality behind the killings of tens of civilians, including children, in Gaza, all one has to do is read Israel's generals and politicians' responses to the Great March of Return. For example, Israeli ex-defense minister Avigdor Lieberman said there were no innocent people in the Gaza Strip. And he said this after Israeli soldiers shot and killed 32 Palestinians during the first 10 days of the non-violent peaceful protests of refugees demanding the implementation of UN Resolution 194, which calls for their right of return and repatriation. They also called for an end to the deadly siege imposed on Gaza. A military spokesperson said in a tweet that, I am quoting, nothing was carried out uncontrolled. Everything was accurate and measured. And we know where every bullet landed, end of quote. So the conclusion is that this is a mentality that we are dealing with, a mentality that I'm sure my comrades in South Africa, in Ireland, and the United States and the US are familiar with. And I am sure my American and South African and Irish comrades feel that this is deja vu. I personally spent 7 years in South Africa, and it was like staying in Palestine. And now let me move the fight of our Black brothers and sisters in the United States of America. The BNC, the Boycott National Committee in Palestine, which is the largest coalition in Palestine of civil society organizations and sectors, the organization that leads the global BDS movement, it issued a statement last month and called on the Palestinian solidarity movements all over the world to stand with the movement for Black Lives and other Black-led organizations in their struggle for justice. Our understanding of the anti-racist events taking place right now in the US is that these protests and events are fundamentally part and parcel of an uprising against an entire system of exploitation and oppression. And the DNC said that this system is organically connected to the crimes perpetrated by US imperialism against peoples of color worldwide, whether in Palestine, or in Afghanistan, or in Iraq, you name it. And these crimes are rooted in the violent, racist, and colonial foundation of the United States of America. The white supremacist ideology that has guided and attempted to whitewash these crimes is still alive, albeit in different forms that we are seeing right now. We, the indigenous population of Palestine, have first-hand experience with settler colonialism, apartheid, and racist violence wielded by Israel's regime of oppression. Its regime of multi-tiered system of oppression, occupation, colonization, and apartheid. But we also know that with the military funding and unconditional support of the United States government, Israel has would not have been able to dispossess us, ethnically cleanse us, and reduce us to lesser humans. Black people in South Africa and many other countries, including the United States of America, have survived decades, if not centuries, of the most inhumane forms of oppression, enslavement, and racial repression. But they have also been teaching humanity as a whole very precious lessons in resistance and sumud, or rather steadfastness. In the United States of America, the system of structural racism is violently enforced by paramilitary police departments. Many, and this is the point, trained by apartheid Israel. So as long as this system of oppression continues, it is up to our grassroots movements, ours in Palestine, South Africa, in Ireland, and in the United States of America, work collectively and intersectionally to dismantle it altogether. Just as the occupying Israeli military forces serve to further entrench the apartheid system against us in Palestine, the US police forces only serve to further entrench the system of American white supremacy and privilege. We together should be discussing how we can best support our collective struggle against injustice and oppression. To our Black brothers and sisters, we are saying this: your resilience in the face of brutal dehumanization is a source of inspiration to our own struggle here in Palestine against Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. And as our comrade Angela Davis, a freedom fighter, puts it, and I'm quoting her, with our oppressors uniting, it is becoming increasingly clear that all our struggles for freedom are interconnected, and that no one will be free until we are all free. End of quote. This is why we in Palestine endorse calls for targeted and strategic boycott and defunding and divestment campaigns against institutions, banks, and corporations that are implicated in the system of racial injustice in the United States of America, the same way we endorsed calls against institutions that were benefiting from from the oppression of our Black brothers and sisters in South Africa. And it is, I must say, it is inspiring to see consciousness growing amongst many people and organizations, and people and organizations are coming together to fight against racism and forms of discrimination. It is time for all of us to get together. People call it intersectionality, intersectional struggle. Some other people call it internationalism. We want to bring this rotten system of white supremacy, of occupation in Palestine, of Jewish supremacy in Palestine, of ethnic cleansing. We want to bring this system to an end. We together in South Africa, Ireland, America, and Palestine can do it if we put our hands together.
That was great. I believe our last panelist is Janelle Barajas. Janelle is a coordinator for Bayan Portland, an overseas chapter of Bayan Philippines, an alliance of progressive Filipino organizations fighting for national democracy with a socialist perspective in the Philippines. She is also a member of Gabriela Portland, a Bayan member organization advancing the militant women's struggle. Janelle's education includes integration with the farmers' rights organizations in the United States, refugees and migrants of the US-Mexico border, farmers in South Korea, and workers and landless peasants in the Philippines.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. First, I want to start out by thanking the DSA for inviting us here to speak on the topic of police violence in the Philippines. And Bayan is very appreciative to the comrades on this panel who we unite and struggle with and hope to forge ahead in solidarity together. So today I'd like to quickly overview how a little country in the Asia Pacific got a police force in the first place, and then talk about the current political conditions which allow police violence and ultimately the armed force of the regime to reach heinous new heights, and then a bit on how the people of the Philippines are fighting back and looking towards a bright socialist future. And so to begin, starting in the 1500s in the Wayback Machine, the Spanish conquistadors in conjunction with the Catholic Church used violent brute force to submit the ethno-linguistic tribes of the Philippines to Spanish rule. The initial resistance took form of separate individual tribal revolts, but by the year 1900, the first nationally organized revolutionary working class resistance called the Katipunan waged armed struggle against the Spanish on the countryside. And so the police force we know today as the Philippine National Police, or the PNP, was constituted by the US imperialists occupying the Philippines at that time as a counter-revolutionary response to the revolt of the Katipunan. And so this US puppeteered police force was utilized to mop up operations against persistent revolutionary fighters in Luzon in the north, the Visayas in the historically Islamic area of Mindanao in the south. The Philippine Constabulary, or what we might conceive of in nowadays terms as the police force, became the first regular army of the Philippines housed under the US Army command. And mainly they were there to squash farmers' rebellions, because for the US imperialists, the farmers' struggle for land and independence was, and still to this day is, the ultimate menace. And I give this background on the birth of the organized police force of the Philippines to illustrate the insidious and calculated nature of the US, because the US understands that dispossession from land and basic human rights breeds resistance, and the US simultaneously creates counter-revolutionary forces. And this is illustrated by the case of the early 1900s, as well as in present time. What we see now are US-Philippine regime-backed paramilitary units who police indigenous people's land and terrorize the locals away to make way for multinational extractive corporations. For example, in 2015, paramilitary units went into the Manobo Indigenous People's School called Alcadev, rounded up the entire community, and in front of all of the community and even the children, executed the principal and two datus, or community leaders, in front of them. And this is not an isolated instance of violence from the Philippine National Police. This is the daily status quo. On my integration trip to the Philippines last summer, I heard stomach-churning accounts of the foulest sort from activists, from church people, indigenous people, farmers, men, women, and children. And it's way too common to meet the wife of a man who maybe he was on his way back from work and is gunned down in cold blood by the Philippine National Police. I heard from an indigenous woman who's part of the Igorot, recounting how when she was a child playing in her mountain home with her siblings, the army, who is often used in place of the police, were camped out near her house, getting drunk and firing their guns off for sport. Her toddler brother blew up in her hands as the stray bullets ripped through her home. And you may have heard of the drug war in the Philippines. It's kind of popular here in US media. It was initially roughly modeled after George W. Bush's war on drugs and is now turned into an all-out bloodbath for the people of the Philippines. As of December 2018, human rights organizations tallying on the ground have estimated over 27,000 deaths as a result of this attack on the poor. And routine are the extrajudicial executions carried out by the police force. And disturbingly, massed assailants paid by local police forces to carry out the murder of a person deemed a drug user, which in most cases, these drug users just mean someone causing trouble for state forces. And in every instance, the victim is poor. For example, in 2017, 17-year-old Kian Loed de los Santos was dragged into an alley by two Philippine National Police officers and shot in the head. They planted a gun on him and said he was threatening the police with it. But surveillance footage shows two cops tackling Kian in a chokehold and dragging him into the dark alley. Duterte, the dictator of the Philippines, said shortly after this, "Why do so many die? Because the police are working, since I'm protecting them." And just this past Thursday in the northern province of Ilocos Sur, a 15-year-old girl was shot 5 times by masked assailants while riding home from the police station where she filed a molestation complaint against 2 policemen from the neighboring San Juan town. The girl had reportedly requested a security escort on her way home from the police station, but it wasn't granted. In July 2019, a 10-man Israeli Defense Force delegation led by the commander of the Nahal Brigade spent 2 weeks training 175 Filipino elite unit officers at Fort Bonifacio. In 2015, this same brigade, the Nahal Brigade, was commanded by a soldier who shot and killed a 17-year-old Palestinian boy as he ran away after throwing a rock at his car. The IDF states the counterterrorism training was part of a program to hone and improve the anti-terror skills of its troops. Terrorism is a complex threat that requires international cooperation and the continuous exchange of knowledge and information. Since 1999, with the Visiting Forces Agreement and the supplemental 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the US military has been allowed to stage military bases and operations out of the Philippines. This has led to continual training of the Philippine Army by the US military in counterterrorism tactics and skills. On my recent trip to the Philippines, I heard reports from locals that battalions of the Philippine Army are being led by white English-speaking Army men. And interestingly enough, the Philippine Army soldiers are being replaced with local Philippine National Police officers. And so how can 27,000 murders by the Philippine National Police, the armed forces of the Philippines, vigilantes, and paramilitary units be justified? In many cases, the victims are children, indigenous people, church people, farmers. And even if they did have shabu on them, shabu is like meth, in which President Duterte's son is the largest smuggler of. Even if they did have shabu on them, what difference would it make? We know the through line is often the victims are activists or part of the resistance against state forces simply because of their social position, like the way an indigenous person would be part of a fight for environmental justice when they're resisting the entry of multinational mining corporations on their ancestral lands. And we can go on and on about how awful the police are, how the gruesome details of every murder without a trial turn out. But Bayan would like to state very plainly here that these violent state forces, such as the Philippine National Police, they carry out this reign of terror in subservience to the bureaucrat capitalists who populate the government of the Philippines. And how Donald Trump has said with his own fecal mouth, the Philippines is a most prime piece of real estate. And those bureaucrat capitalists connive with the US to constitute the US Duterte fascist regime, to keep the Philippines a semi-colony, to open up the arable countryside for US national extractive corporations, to be a dumping ground for surplus goods from US corporations. And I don't even want at this moment to open up this hellhole of a topic, but a playground for the US military to stage their weapons of war against China in the form of military bases, freedom to conduct military exercises on the territory, and to rape and murder the locals with impunity, and to be open, obvious, and outright tools of the US imperialist war machine. And we're on the eve now of the newest desperate attempt to suppress the people's movement for national democracy and freedom. The passing of the anti-terror bill in the Philippines allows for any dissent against President Duterte's government, even as simple as a Facebook repost, to label that person as a terrorist and be met with even more militarized response. But there's hope yet, because for the last 51 years, the Philippines has been in an active state of revolution. The main driving force are the peasants and the workers, and the Communist Party of the Philippines has been guiding the nation towards an era of socialist construction. And of course, as you know, socialist construction doesn't happen overnight. And so since 1969, the New People's Army has been waging an armed struggle against the berserk US-Philippine state, fighting the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police on the countryside. And the fight for national democracy and the legal movement is far from over. The fight for socialism, where the poorest people have political power, is far from over. And we know that US imperialism will not willingly give up its prime piece of real estate. And so to achieve a just and lasting peace from the fascist, physical, economic, and social violence, we must continue to fight on all fronts. And for us Americans, that means international solidarity. So to close, the fight for the liberation of the Filipino people is deeply reliant on the broad anti-imperialist struggle around the world. The aim to liberate a colony of the US is an aim to strike blows against the US war machine, to weaken its tentacles so that other liberation struggles may win too. And Bayan would like to extend the most militant and solid salute to the Black liberation struggle. And finally, to close, again, we invite all those who are interested to join us in Portland for a mobilization around July 27th in response to the lies that will inevitably be spewed by dictator Rodrigo Duterte during the 2020 Philippines State of the Nation address. And for those who would like something to study in relation to envisioning a freer and more just world, please read the Comprehensive Agreement on Socio-Economic Reforms. I don't have time to dive into it here, but it's an agreement by that the National Democratic Front of the Philippines is trying to reach with the traditional US Duterte regime. The document lays out the foundations for an economy and society that serves the common good. Mabuhay DSA, and long live international solidarity.
Wonderful, thank you, Janelle. There we go.
Sorry, I just wanted to flash the links.
No, that's great, thanks. I'm glad we were able to do that. So now that everybody's been able to share their perspectives, I think I wanted to honor the questions submitted by folks who registered for the panel. And so we will start with, I think, one of the best questions that we got, which is, we see that often there's an international coordination of police tactics, training, and strategy. However, each state's police forces are the result of historical forces which are unique in social situations that police enforce. Which is to say, I've heard kind of the same thing, very closely related with fascism, right? That each country's version of fascism is unique to their historical construction. And so what is the role of identifying the unique social conditions that exist? And how are we to understand that the international coordination in relation to these unique social conditions? So how do we build an international movement while still recognizing kind of individual historical reasons for the rise of police? And so I don't know if there's somebody who wants to take that question first. All right, not all at once, please, you guys. Anybody?
I have some thoughts, quick thoughts. One is that I am like pretty resistant to, I feel like there's a tendency within the Western left to particularize conditions in a specific area to be like, this is distinct from this, and there's no, like, it's unacceptable to find the connections between them. And I feel like that is a mistake. It is like a tactical mistake, and it has been so for like a very long time. Because there's like a clear through line, like even listening to all of the panelists, and by the way, this panel is like hot fire, I can't believe it, it's so great. But like listening to all the panels, like talking about the policing in their specific context and why it's unfolding this way, it's always racialized, colonized people rising up against capitalism, rising up against neocolonialism and neoliberalism, who are being treated like straight up terrorist forces. And it's happening for the same reasons across contexts. And I feel like we have to recognize that. We have to see the through line to understand why policing looks like this. Particularly in the United States, like people, every time the police like tear gas a crowd, people are like shocked. They're like, I can't believe it, that was my grandma. And I'm like, why? They don't consider you to be, like, they're not serving you. They consider you to be the enemy. And if we understood why this is happening, if we saw that through line of people rising up against capitalism, of people rising up against imperialism and being treated like the enemy, then we would understand why it's happening in place after place after place. So like I'm a Pan-Africanist. So like, you know, I'm a person of African descent who's fighting for the liberation of Africa, who's fighting to unite the diaspora. So I'm extremely against particularizing the condition of African people in the United States, but like in general, like I question the strategy, honestly, because I feel like it's created like a bunch of disconnected movements who do not see the connections between them.
Okay, Chopper, it looked like you were about to respond, but you're on mute.
Did you say
Can
Tato?
you hear me now?
No, Chopper.
Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you now, Chopper.
I just wanted to say that after listening to the speakers, and I feel that where we are here in Ireland, especially in the north of Ireland, given the situation in regards to policing, but for a lot of people here, they are of the opinion that things are relatively, things are all right, that there are no problems here. And we in National Yard and other groups that are out there, we are saying that things may have changed, but listening to our speakers here, that it's clear that the media and the Western media in particular, are putting out a spin that in regards to, especially in Ireland here, that things are peaceful. The local police force, the PSNI, is more democratic than it's ever been. And I would argue against that. But taking what has happened in the United States, a lot of people here and it's terrible what happened obviously with George Floyd, but when we see people out on the streets, see the thousands of people, millions of people protesting, we here in Belfast were out protesting. And there was two peaceful protests, one in Belfast city centre, one in Derry city centre. And the cops handed out, this is in support of the Black Lives Matter thing in the United States, they handed out fines. The following week, there was far more people out protesting in support of the cops, and not one fine was handed out. So what we are saying is that the cops, that they may give this impression that they are a democratic force, that they're doing it for the benefit of the people. We would argue that they are inherently sectarian, like they've always been, the same as cops in the United States, South Africa, and maybe other countries around the world, that there's the racism is there. So sectarianism, racism, in my opinion, is exactly the same.
Did anybody else want to try to answer those questions?
Yeah, I can add something really quick. The National Democratic Movement of the Philippines really wants to emphasize that there should be a deep effort in the United States to understand U.S. imperialism, its history, the way that it recruits to its ranks, its ideological and even political inner workings, and really to understand imperialism and to unite on its definition, we can start building the working class movement. as being like the point of unity, because really like we want to organize the 99% against the ruling class, against the 1%. It's important to resolve the contradictions of US imperialism, to build the anti-imperialist united front and the anti-imperialist movement here in the United States. And really like understanding other people's liberation struggles for self-determination, understanding the economic conditions that allows for such heinous acts in other countries such as South Africa, in Ireland, here in the US, understanding the economic conditions that allows for these things to happen can really help unite the 99% against the narrowest target, against the ruling class. So yeah, just popularizing the anti-imperialist line.
Yeah, and one thing I would add is that, imperialism affects people here in the United States. We see them in every military recruitment office, particularly in Black and Brown communities. And so it's certainly the case that people, at least in this country, in the United States, don't bear the same benefits from imperialism as was the case, 40 years ago. We saw this in, I'm myself a labor person, we saw this in the outsourcing of jobs, right, to people overseas. Those jobs are not coming back. And so there's certainly far more harm than good in terms of how US imperialism affects people here in this country. Our next question, a lot of folks on the panel kind of gave kind of quasi-historical talks on state violence. This question is particularly, I think, relevant. What tactics of resistance could be used by protesters to continue gaining ground in the struggle that we have seen succeed in the past? So what past tactics have really worked? Okay, Tato, did you want to?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I could speak a bit about what we've been doing, particularly in the lockdown. And I mean, yeah, police violence in South Africa is really an old story, and in fact, I think perhaps connected to the last question, in some ways, what we've seen is sort of like a while. It's taken a while for people to build a kind of outrage against, like, blatant murder by the security forces during the lockdown. But what we've done is that various organizations and groups have gotten together, I think so, and we've established a coalition preempting these issues that we assumed would happen, because very early on the minister of no, not the minister of the president announced that the lockdown would be enforced by the police and the military, and of course for everyone it was just unclear why that would be the case. And so the C19 People's Coalition very quickly got together. It's like over 200 or 300, I think, at this point. And as specifically in the anti-repression working group, there's a strong move towards documenting violations, being out there and actually doing the hard work of documenting. And so we've done a lot of work to get monitors out to at least oversee some of the work that the security forces are doing. And when people have been confined in their homes, it's been social media documentation and media reporting that has been absolutely critical in highlighting exactly what is going on. Of course, there are problems in terms of, which stories get coverage and that sort of thing. I mean, even just here, only one name rose to prominence because that was a case that was taken to court on an urgent basis. The story of Collins Khosa, but a lot of other people have been killed, injured, in very violent, heavy-handed policing. And so documentation becomes absolutely critical. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
I would just like to make a point, just very briefly, in regards to policing here in Belfast, especially when this is the time in which the Orange Order, which is an organization, which is no exaggeration to say, it's like a Ku Klux Klan, where they march through nationalist Catholic areas, even though I'm not a Catholic myself, I'm an Irish Republican and socialist, but they are facilitated by the local police force, and the tensions that are starting to arise already, where it's a place in which I personally, and I know a lot of my friends and comrades, can never even walk up. And this is a road about 3 miles away from here. It's called the Shankill Road. There's a lot of places around this part of Belfast which are predominantly unionist, loyalist. And if anyone was to even go on, check it out online, if you're fortunate enough to be able to visit Belfast at this particular time of year, you'll see the Union Jacks, you'll see Israeli flags, you'll see United States flags, all these flags. And the flags you'll never see are Palestinian flags. You'll never see tricolors. You'll never see a hammer and sickle on these roads. So the tensions that are starting to rise here in Belfast, especially, and in other parts of the north, of course, are there, and the local police force. And even though that we would like to see more people protesting against this, that a lot of people are afraid to go out on the streets, not just because of this pandemic which is taking place, but over the past number of years, there's a fear for people to go out and protest. And unfortunately, that is, for us, it's very hard for us to try and get people to go out and protest against the local police force, because, as I said earlier, they're giving this impression that they are a democratic police force, which has the support of a firm number of people here.
I just want to add really quickly, I appreciate the comments of the previous two speakers, particularly the speaker from Azania from South Africa, who talked about the importance of documentation, because I definitely think that we've seen that in the United States for a very long time, that the day-to-day reality that African people experience from police terrorism in the United States is oftentimes like not visible to anyone but us or other colonized peoples until it's documented and like shared widely. It's like a double-edged sword, because I can like see someone that looks like me die on Facebook on a daily basis, and that's pretty intense as a colonized person. But there's no question that documentation led to a greater awareness of what was happening to us. So yeah. But I also want to say that like right now we're in a moment in the United States where people are beginning to have conversations about a world without police. And like, as someone who came into the movement like 6 years ago, I remember saying abolish the police, and people were like, you are out of your mind. Like, it wasn't even like people were not considering it. And now it's like a mainstream conversation. Now there's like New York Times op-eds talking about what could this look like. And so I think it's extremely important to recognize that we're at this moment as a result of organizing, particularly the organizing of African, Indigenous, and colonized people who were already creating alternatives to policing within their communities, because we already understood what it's taking. It seems like it's taking folks a while to understand is that the police were not here to help us. They never were. They're here to control us. They're here to harm us. And so the best way to protect our communities is to keep them out. Is create alternatives to keep each other safe. Is create alternatives to protect each other that does not require calling in state forces that are going to brutalize people and make the situation worse. So like, begin to have conversations about what a world without police could look like, continuous conversations, and begin to like present the alternative and build the alternative in our communities. That's extremely important. But also extremely crucial at this moment, especially as abolish the police is like a mainstream position, is to internationalize it. To say what the police are doing in the United States is what the US police are teaching, security forces all over the world. That what the police are doing in the United States, the US military is doing all over the world. To begin to make these international connections of the abolish the police conversation is not confined to the domestic context.
Actually, that's a great segue to, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Janelle.
I just wanted to add something that, because I totally echo what the other panelists have said, but just to add something about more like long-term strategy type of things is, because we already know that the reactionary state, right, they use tactics to divide the working class, they use tactics to divide the press people. So seeking deep unity to fuel the tactics, to really principled struggle through political education and really deepening our understanding of liberation struggles around the world and other communities, and to really forge that deep solidarity and deep community can really like take an activist and turn them into an organizer, right? Like, these are the long-term strategies of political education that we really need to continue practicing. So essentially taking this moment, materially understanding the conditions, organizing solidly with education and in conjunction with practice, and tactically continue to embed the working class and agitating them, because really the working class is like the decisive force in history. So yeah, I think like my answer is less on the day-to-day and more of the longer term kind of coalition building, united front building, international solidarity building. It really starts with like the deep political education and sharing, of course. Check.
This next question is specifically for Tato. Would a call to defund the police be relevant to or feasible in light of police reform in South Africa or similar contexts in Africa or the global South?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, because I think that's something a lot of us are grappling with right here, because it's been quite inspiring to see the impact that the movement in the United States has been able to have, like been able to deliver very tangible results quite instantly, where people are actually being forced to think about the future of the police and to reimagine what society could look like. But in South Africa, I think that is we're grappling with it, I think, because, you know, in this country, we're dealing with a police force that has failed to implement very basic recommendations. So even after the Marikana Commission of Inquiry, where a commission sat for 2 years, as I said, and an expert panel worked on a report for 2 years and submitted that, and had, like, I think over 100 recommendations that the government could implement. The government's still sitting on that report and has not released it. So I think in the US, where I think they're further along in terms of seeing the impact or the lack of impact that reforms can have. In South Africa, we're dealing with a situation where there just isn't implementation at all. And so I think in Cape Town in particular, where the SJC has done a lot of work around police resources. It's very interesting to see what the future of that kind of a program will look like, because in Cape Town, I actually just want to pull it up, but essentially, I don't know if I can even share my screen. Maybe can I share my screen? Am I allowed to? Let me see.
I think I'm not the host.
So let me, I just want to share an image which captures what the situation in Cape Town is, for example, right? Where if you can see that picture that's loading, that's a community from Khayelitsha. And what their banner says is Rondebosch had 6 murders in 10 years. Khayelitsha had 326 murders in 1 year. Rondebosch has more police resources than Khayelitsha. And so it's interesting to see the ways in which, a defund the police and abolish the police kind of conversation can take hold here, where even the movement against gender-based violence has taken on a very retributive form. And a lot of people who subscribe to an abolitionist kind of framework want to move away from something like that. But in South Africa, where violence against women is so rife, members of the public are calling for harsher sentences, right? And so I think many people would say that, that is in a completely different direction to what a defund the police and an abolitionist kind of framework would want to see, essentially. So I don't know if I've answered that question at all, but these are some of the kind of nuances that sort of shape the way in which this conversation that is happening globally is going to look like in the South African context. Yeah.
Yeah, so so thank you for that. Speaking of nuance, I myself, I'm a union organizer. I've helped coordinate or support several strikes and negotiated public sector contracts. And so in the United States, police unions have played a substantial role, not just in preventing individual accountability when there have been murders, but also for the most part, preventing police reform. And the reason for that is because a lot of the union rights that they have is tangled up in the union rights that everybody has, who has the right to join a union. And so I'm wondering, this question is for everybody, but specifically for the folks overseas, do police unions play the same role in preventing reform, just even moderate reforms, in your respective countries?
Well, the police force here, when they went through a process where they were saying that they were changing from the RUC, which was the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and before that it was the Royal Irish Constabulary, before our country was divided in 1922. So from over the past 20 years or more, when they were saying that they were involved in policing, reforming the police service, as they call it, the service, and they were trying to attract more Catholics, because traditionally from the RIC, which had a lot of Catholics in it, by the way, up until when it was then referred to as the RUC, it was predominantly unionist Protestant force, which was very much fighting against, discriminating against Catholics and nationalists. Then what they are trying to portray themselves as now is as a reformed police force. There's 9,000 of them, and there's only a population of less than 1 million people here in the north of Ireland. There's a lot of cities in your own country, the United States, that have far bigger populations than that. And the police force here are, in my opinion, irreformable. And no matter, they have a lot of cheerleaders, the people there who at one time were as opposed to them as what I am, and members of Lasso York. And so it is very difficult for us to do it on a regular basis. We'll come out and try to hold them to account. But as regarding unions, the unions in regards to the local police force, it's non-existent, because they are a law unto themselves. And I would argue that, listening to our speakers here and having read a lot of what different police forces in the Western world, as in the United States, South Africa, the Philippines, and other countries, they're totally irreformable for the most part.
Yeah, I think I could probably jump in. I'm not sure that the police union here has the same kind of power that exists in the US backing the police force there. But I suppose, you see, the thing is with issues around accountability in South Africa, those have been exacerbated by a multitude of factors, right? So in one instance where there's an oversight body that is supposed to be able to investigate abuses by the police force, that institution sits within the Ministry of Police and has for many years battled with being under-resourced and underfunded. And this is a problem that is deeply systemic, and what was found last year by journalist organization is that, in fact, what IPID investigators, who are incredibly overworked, that they simply cannot manage the caseload that they have. But what they found was essentially that they've been systematically prematurely closing cases in order to manipulate the case management system to boost their performance figures. And so, just to give you a snapshot of what police accountability in South Africa looks like, without, say, the intervention of a police union preventing the police from being held accountable, over a period of about 7 years, where about 42,000 complaints against the police have been lodged. These are complaints ranging from murder, torture, rape, assault, illegal discharge of firearm. Those are the kinds of cases that have been lodged with IPID. Over a 7-year period, only 530, just over 530, have resulted in a successful prosecution of a police officer out of 42,000. So that's about 1.3% of a successful conviction rate. And a part of that problem is that when cases get sent from IPID, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, when they get sent to the prosecution, there seems to be a lack of an appetite for prosecuting the police. And there is something in an internal policy document for the prosecution that when any kind of cases need to be instituted against state officials, including the police, additional permission is needed in order to carry out that prosecution. And so you can see that there's like just having an internal policy like that can make it difficult to hold the police accountable sufficiently. So institutions that could play an important role in holding the police accountable are just not supported enough. And I think over the past 10 years, we've seen how those institutions have been undermined severely by political interference and corruption and all of that. So I think here it's less so a strong police union and more like, the political will around ensuring that the police can sufficiently be held accountable is just not there.
Thanks for that. So the next question is, how can we help others who cannot see a free police, how can we help others who cannot see a police-free world to begin considering it? What do you believe is the best way to move forward, trying to convince the opposition to your goals to change their position? So this is generally just kind of, like I said, I'm a union organizer, and a lot of my work is just kind of meeting people where they're at politically, because the fact of the matter is there is a significant portion of the working class that is reactionary, that don't, they might believe in moderate police reforms, but it's difficult for them to imagine what public safety could look like, what alternative models could exist. So does anybody want to take that?
I think the comrade from Buy-in USA nailed it. It's political education, and it's like building intentional connections between domestic anti-colonial movements and international anti-colonial movements, and seeing that through line between struggles against police terrorism across contexts. Like the key is getting people to understand the particular role that police play, because there's like a clear historical basis for the condition that we are in right now. And I feel like the way to do that is like systematic political education, is like connecting struggles across borders, is like fundamentally examining the nature of the police in a way that's going to be accessible to people. So I think political education is the short way of saying this is political education is the absolute key, and also building connections between struggles of colonized peoples across borders is the key.
Anybody else want to add to that?
I mean, I definitely agree. I think that's absolutely it. But I think in South Africa, what we're battling with, and I think what I was trying to articulate a little earlier is, there was a kind of lack in outrage around the deaths that occurred during the lockdown. And it was when the George Floyd incident happened and the Breonna Taylor incident happened, and that movement sort of picked up in the US, suddenly people were far more aware about deaths that have been occurring in South Africa. So it would seem then that, the issue here is one where, police violence is not just about race as it is as clearly laid out in the US, where it's really about like a white supremacist, racist police force. In South Africa, the issue is equally racist, but because the dynamic is, I think, complicated by class, middle and upper class South Africa, who have not experienced the lockdown in the way that poor people across the country have just been shielded from that reality. And that's a reality that poor people live with all the time. What happened in the lockdown was just that was highlighted because people were forced to see it. But other than that, middle and upper class South Africa can forget about it. This year marks eight years since Marikana, and no police officer has been charged for the deaths on the 16th of August. People only remember it in August when all the media outlets are writing about it, and that happens, and then we can just quickly forget and we move on, and it just goes on like that. So I think because poor people do not hog so much of the media and the public discourse that happens in South Africa, those issues that mainly affect poor Black people can be sidelined and can be set aside. So I'm wondering how you get a somewhat apathetic middle class to care, because those are the same people who use private security to protect their own communities and are living in gated communities, and they see the police force as a police force that is theirs, and then they don't see the police force as an inherently anti-Black and anti-poor institution. So it's there's a need to kind of build that kind of force that kind of empathy out of middle and upper class South Africans, and it's just not clear how that could happen. I may just be tired. It's 9 o'clock here in the evening, so I don't. It's a difficult one, but yeah, I think we're doing a lot of work to keep the spotlight on that.
I think you bring up a great point, which is what is the role of the middle class, in these struggles, domestically and internationally. I don't know if anybody else wanted to address that. Also, while you think about that, I just wanted to briefly say that we got word that Israel is conducting airstrikes in Gaza right now. So that's presumably the reason why our comrade Javier could not join us. But does anybody have any thoughts on what Tato said in terms of how to relate to people?
Yeah. Chopper, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say there that in regards to, if we're talking about, I know it is a cliche, but society needs changed. And when you have people in working class Republican areas, for the most part, who never trusted the cops, a lot of us still don't trust the cops. And this comes about, and there's ongoing cases at the minute in regards to the recent history of collusion between unionist murder gangs who were involved in this particular conflict. There's over 4,000 or over 3,500 people have been killed. The majority of them were killed by the IRA, but a lot of them were killed by unionist murder gangs who were, or some, depends on what part of the world you're from, counter-insurgency gangs. And they were heavily supported by the local police force. And the issue of collusion is one that is still not being dealt with. A lot of families, there's been a lot of high-profile cases, like lawyers have been killed by who have been set up by the local police force, by members of the local police force, and have been supported by their leadership, and goes right to the heart of the British government. And whenever we are saying to people that how can this police force be changed, the people who come out and support them mostly are it's to be expected, are unionists, middle class Catholics, and unfortunately some former comrades of mine, some men who I was in prison with, who are cheerleaders for them. So in that particular case, it's how we as socialists here in Ireland trying to change the mindset of people, never mind trying to get people to go out on the streets, never mind get people to stand up, and not military action, by the way, because we have to be careful what we say. And but if you have a police force there that is still inherently, as I said from the outset, sectarian and anti-republican, it's going to be very, very hard to change that.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, please do.
I think the answer to this question also kind of answers the question of like, why are we going to win? Really, this is like, to me, very much like honing the revolutionary patience that sets us apart from the reactionaries, right? Really using the principles of unity and step-by-step organizing, because I think can be dangerous to pathologize the moderates or pathologize or like really like treat them as like abnormal. Really, us as organizers have to understand who we're organizing and what moves them. And it's like the slow patience, the painstaking mass work, the shifting of thoughts that sets us apart from the reactionary forces, and really linking a person's current struggle to the larger issues, to the international issues. And it takes like hella time, trust, so much patience, and a lot of persistence, asking questions first, and really like interrogating capitalism by way of building relationships, right? Interrogating the perceived need for the state, for the perceived need for the police, listening to them, and then linking and raising that to larger issues. And so like really like the middle class or the petite bourgeoisie or the petit b or whatever you want to call them, we do have a role, right? It's like we don't have the primary role, like the workers are the makers of history. But there is a reason why moderates exist. There's a reason why reactionaries exist. And even though like it sucks and it's going to take a long time, we do need to organize the 99%. But really like do that scientifically by like recognizing that different classes will show you the world through a different lens, and really meeting people where they're at, and doing this in a way that's like slow and patient and revolutionary. So yeah, that's kind of my answer for how do you show people that we don't need police anymore.
Can I add something really quickly about police terrorism in the United States? So I think it's actually intentional that from the outside, it looks purely racialized. That's like the way that it's like talked about in US media. They're like, there's a war on Black men or whatever. And that's like true, but like the specific, it's like we have to be more specific about who this is happening to, right? Because for every single African that is murdered by police who's caught on video, who like goes viral, there are hundreds more on a daily basis that we never hear about. And it's not middle-class African people. It's not upper-class African people. It's poor and working-class African and indigenous and colonized people who are the primary victims of police terrorism in the United States. It is not just racialized. It has a distinct class basis for who is being criminalized, who is being murdered, and then whose deaths get explained away. Because there is like a huge like group of people in the United States across races who, when someone, you know, gets murdered running from the police, or someone gets murdered for shoplifting, it's like they had it coming. That's someone else's property. Like there is like a majority of the US population that thinks that way. And it's because of this class component where we're taught that, you know, people who are poor and working class, people who are like lumpen proletariat are disposable, are enemies of an existing social order that middle class people benefit from, that the police exist to control. So like, I feel like the way that the US on the global stage talks about police terrorism against African people very intentionally obscures that class component. And it also benefits, you know, African petty bourgeois, like, you know, race talkers, whatever. The people who are like making, like selling books and whatever off this particular moment, it benefits them to say it's like a general African problem while ignoring the class component. And I think it's really, really important for us in this context and in anti-imperialist organizing to say like who specifically is happening to and why.
So speaking of the middle class, what action can nonprofits and other companies and organizations that don't do direct work to address police and state violence do to raise awareness and make a change in our community? And I also encourage everybody to take the opportunity to advertise your respective organizations in answering this question. Anybody like to address what, you know, not everybody has the the opportunity to work a job that is considered care work, where they're passionate. Some folks just put on a uniform and work at hotels. My family works at a flea market. And so what do folks who have a 9-to-5, what can they do to address police and state violence?
I think the question had been answered earlier in the sense that when we all, well, prospective organizations and countries will know what is needed, but I can't for the life of me think that any middle class or upper class person would even think of tackling the question of policing. And unfortunately, because of this pandemic, when we're talking about police violence is, as we see in the United States, we see in South Africa and the Philippines, what is going on here today. It isn't always when they are shooting people, hitting people with plastic bullets, rubber bullets, and obviously killing people. It's their surveillance, which is happening all the time, and it's a fear factor there. And when there's fear, and they don't have to be booting doors in. I myself was shot by the cops at one time. I'm not crying about it. That's part and parcel of what struggle is, but that is deliberate on their part, where they have that fear. And we, as in Lasher Yard, when we are turning around and talking about getting people to stand up to policing, whenever there's houses being raided, whenever people are stopped and searched, which happens a lot in Republican areas, a lot of people walk by because they're afraid, they don't want to be labelled. And I'm sure it's the same in other countries, where when the cops stop people, when the cops arrest certain people, unless they're well-known political activists, a lot of people are afraid to come out and support that. But we're saying to people, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid to challenge them. Do not be afraid when you're stopped by the cops. Know your rights. And it's something, if you're going to a solicitor or a lawyer, that you do know your rights. And everybody has rights, but we all know that a lot of these human rights are totally and utterly abused by the state, deliberately to put people down. And if the point is, what some of our speakers said earlier, is about education. And education doesn't mean to sit down and talk, sit with a book or give lectures, but making people, when I go out in the streets and meeting people, and when I'm walking up and down the road, talking to people about it. And that's what you're hoping to try and get people involved in politics, even just local politics. But there's apathy there. And it's not, I heard one of our speakers saying earlier about apathy among the middle classes. Unfortunately, that apathy is there. And too many people are sitting saying that this pandemic is going to affect, and it is, there's going to be, unemployment's very high here in working class areas in Belfast, and it's going to get worse. People are going to be forced out of their homes because they can't afford their rent, or if they're lucky enough to have a mortgage. Jobs are going to be lost, and the people who are going to be enforcing the evictions of people is going to be the local police force, even though it's not within their remit to do so, but they will be protecting the bailiffs. And we're calling on people, don't just take this sitting down, get out and stand up against it.
Does anyone else want to share?
I'm not totally sure my answer is going to be like the exact, like, how does a company or a nonprofit like help? But I do want to say that like workers and companies have historically been the decisive force in creating change, regardless if they're at a 9-to-5. And we're at a crossroads now where we see a lot of the middle class, losing their jobs, right? And like starting to become part of the working class, part of the proletariat, the proletarianization of the middle class. And really that like creates that dispossession, right? That I talked about, like in terms of the Philippines, where the middle class always has a choice. They can undulate and ebb and flow between joining the ranks of the bourgeoisie, joining the ranks and working for the ruling class, or they can join the ranks of like the revolutionary movement, right? And so it's like the same system that makes us work our jobs is most likely the exploiting system that creates like these neoliberal policies. And so really like being an individual who works at a job, like I think the question of how can we like help monetarily is an important one, but I think it's also how can the individual learn to live collectively and really internalize their part as the working class? How can they engage in political education? How can they link and raise the struggles of the international, right? It's like, you know, do what you can through your work and educate where you can at your job, but really we want to build a mass movement. So, yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is like, well, first of all, for like a nonprofit or a business, like the number one thing that you could do is like share your resources and your infrastructure with no strings attached. No strings attached. Do not attempt to direct movement in any kind of way. Do not attempt to like add the nonprofit sheen to anti-colonial movements. Like, don't do that. Like, if you have money and you have skills, like share those, but otherwise, like, please do not try to direct movement. But also, like, the single most important thing that anyone can do, regardless of whether or not they're working for a private entity or a nonprofit, is join an organization fighting for social justice. Join an organization fighting against police terrorism. Join an organization building alternative models for safety in your community. Join an organization in this struggle against imperialism, against colonialism, against capitalism, regardless of who you are, because we need you in the fight right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all of that. I was probably just going to add, you know, share the resources of people who are working on that stuff. So information that people are developing and putting out, circulate that and get ordinary members of the public to read it. People need to inform themselves. They need to keep themselves informed about what's happening. So yeah, I think that's absolutely critical, and I think documentation is still just as key. You know, filming the police, they hate it, and it does come at a risk, but it's absolutely important that when we see abuses, we document it. Yeah.
There have been actually curious academics in particular have made discussion about what forms of film is most helpful in terms of a police accountability. And it seems like there are differing opinions, and I'm not sure if anybody wants to share, but I know some folks advocate for police cameras. And then other folks have argued, well, that actually, when you understanding situation from filming of one's, you know, from the police, you actually become more sympathetic to that perspective versus something like filming an interaction by police based on dash cams, that those seem to provide the most objective kind of perspective in terms of the entire situation. Other folks have argued that body cameras, you know, they help aid in the in building the police state, where we have just constant surveillance in our communities. And certainly, you know, where police are, they harass poor and then Black and brown communities. So I was just wondering if there was any thoughts or anything like that in terms of, obviously when Tato speaks, she means accountability, or I'm sorry, documentation on behalf of the community. But I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts on that.
I have very strong opinions on this subject as someone who was in the Black Lives Matter movement and also organizing against police terrorism, because I agree with, I think, the third position you stated, that body cameras, dash cameras, funding for body cameras on the part of police just increases the scope of the surveillance state, just increases the means in which they can observe a behavior and then criminalize us for that behavior. And that we have seen over and over and over again, that even with like clear footage, either from a dash cam or a body cam or a cell phone, these police are not getting prosecuted. They're not facing consequences. And when it comes to the specific case of like police controlled footage from body cameras and dash cameras, like the police control the server. The police decide when it's on or off. The police decide when it's even going to be released in the use of a case. And so all we're doing when we're pushing for body cameras to be worn by police is giving them more budget and giving them more ways to watch us. When it comes to like documentation on the part of like the community, like on behalf of the community, I think it's like an extremely important tool, like a crucial tool. But as we're seeing, we saw it 6 years ago with the Ferguson and Baltimore uprisings, and we're seeing it now in Minneapolis, in New York, and all over the country, where people are documenting African and colonized youth engaged in acts of resistance, and those youth are going to jail for a long, long, long time. And so there needs to be like a really fundamental conversation. First of all, like I'm against any form of surveillance or expanding surveillance on the part of the state. But when it comes to community documentation, there needs to be a conversation about who are we recording and why? Because if you just want to catch an African youth setting a cop car on fire and put it on your Facebook because it looks cool, and that kid goes to jail for like 10 years or 20 years because you just want to clout, like that's a problem. That's a problem. Like African and colonized youth are already extremely criminalized within this context. And so people documenting these actions need to be focused on what the state is doing and being extremely careful about not subjecting colonized and oppressed peoples to even more state repression with evidence that the people are providing. So against more state surveillance, but also let's have a conversation about what community documentation actually looks like and what it's actually doing.
Yeah, whenever we do look at obviously George Floyd, even go as far back with Rodney King, when people were filming those brutal attacks and the killings. Then we looked at the likes of during the Catalan referendum, when the Spanish police and the Catalan police and supported by the Spanish government, they weren't worried about cameras. They were going and they were battering people off the streets. You see it. We've seen it in places in Belfast. We've seen it in London. There's cameras all over the show, and the cops themselves, are they worried about it? They don't seem to be worried about it because the governments of that particular country or that particular state are saying you've nothing to worry about here. As for cops having body cams, they're not. I don't know what they're only a recent phenomenon here in Ireland, and again, it's this perception that they are having them to protect citizens, and they won't be getting involved in any abuses that they had been involved in the past. Does it stop them? I would argue it doesn't, and the reason has to be asked, or you have to ask the question is, why do they have them in the first place? Is it to protect themselves in case? And I would argue that if they themselves, we've seen incidents of the dash cam on their cars when they went out and they've shot people, killed people. They didn't seem particularly worried about it. And we all know it's a very rare occasion in which cops, especially in the United States, are being charged with murder. And if we look here in the history of this conflict from 1969, there has been 3 cops have been charged with killings, murders, and not one, but none of them have ever been convicted of those killings because the state comes in and protects them.
Tato, I was wondering if you could maybe flesh out a little bit what documentation looks like from a community perspective, because it might help people get involved who maybe don't see themselves as the type to hold a megaphone or even protest, but maybe it's something that they could do on their personal time. That might be a step forward in terms of doing this kind of work.
Yeah. So one brilliant example of documentation that we saw even just during the lockdown, when local law enforcement in Cape Town were instituting an eviction. They were demolishing shacks because they argued that they were set up and were unoccupied, and so they were demolishing them. And organizations and community members could just come by and film them breaking down the shack structures, and those were circulated and went viral basically on social media and sparked the kind of outrage that was necessary, that could apply the kind of pressure to the city of Cape Town. Of course, that had to be backed up by litigation. And so, the city of Cape Town had to be taken to court in order to stop those evictions. But, even then, that hasn't stopped them from still demolishing structures, even during the lockdown, in spite of a moratorium on all evictions and demolitions of structures. So, it's important to draw attention to the issue, and that can only come from people just filming it right away. And the more people that can do it, the less the police are able to basically go after people who are filming them. But again, it does come at risks. I mean, in the Collins Khosa matter, where he was assaulted by members of the military, and I think members of his family were also assaulted, and he died because of those injuries that he sustained. There were neighbors and there were family members who were filming that incident, but they were then taken by the military and assaulted and had their footage taken. And so there's always a risk of reprisals when people do want to just film on their phones. I think even in the Black Lives Matter movement, where people have filmed a killing and they've ended up arrested because of that kind of footage. So it definitely comes at a risk. But even with the use of less lethal weapons, it's absolutely critical to document the ways in which those less lethal weapons are actually dangerous and can be lethal and can cause grave injuries. I mean, there's an article that's been circulating, I think, on what's been happening in the US, but those are injuries that we've seen even during the student protests, where someone has lost an eye from a ricocheting rubber bullet that basically bounced off of a building. And what we've found, and I mean, I think a lot of work has gone into understanding the rubber bullet as a weapon, as a less lethal weapon. Apparently, it is inherently indiscriminate, and that means it is a weapon that cannot be used in crowd management incidences. And the kinds of injuries that rubber bullets are able to inflict on people means that they need to be taken out of the hands of the police. And so even in that eviction where the police were called out, that eviction in Cape Town where the police were called out to sort of push the community away and that sort of thing, they were able to pick up the shells and that sort of thing and actually take pictures of the kinds of weapons that the police are using, because that's an important thing to pay close attention to as well. What kinds of weapons are they using? Where are they getting their weapons from? And what kind of injuries are being sustained from the kinds of weapons that they're using? Because they'll always argue that, we're using less lethal weapons, but less lethal doesn't mean it's not lethal. Less lethal doesn't mean it cannot cause really grave injuries, and that's the danger. So, I mean, if we just think of people that have been killed, if we just think of how many injuries, life-changing injuries, have been sustained from brutal, heavy-handed, excessive uses of force, it's honestly just disgusting. I mean, during the lockdown specifically, where IPID had to report to Parliament about the number of cases that they've received, and these are old numbers. I think from the beginning of the lockdown, so the 26th or 28th of March, they're about the 5th of May. They had received over 828 complaints against the police. Of that, they say that 376 were specifically lockdown related. What is that 376 complaints look like? 280 were assault cases, just assault, where the police are beating people. And even if you look at the complaints against the complaints of apparent deaths caused by police action, many people are being beaten to death. And so documenting that is going to be absolutely critical for any kind of litigation that will go forward, or any kind of civil claims that would be instituted. And if we're able to even figure out exactly which police officer is involved in these incidents, that's important. That's often like the massive stumbling block in cases against the police. You can't identify the police officer, and documentation can play an important role in just doing that. Which police officer was responsible for this? But again, it does come at a risk to people. Sorry, that was a bit long.
That's great, thank you. We are at 2 o'clock exactly, so I want to thank everybody for their time and lending their expertise in the topic of state violence and police and how they're connected domestically and internationally. And thank everybody who's viewing right now on Facebook. Thank you for taking the time to understand more about this topic. So with that, I just want to bid everybody goodbye. Thank you so much.